I'm here to kind of help facilitate the building of this bottle brick bench. And one component of the bottle brick bench is what's known as Cobb. And Cobb is a traditional material from the United Kingdom, England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. And Cobb means lump of earth. And this was one of the original building materials in the UK, in England, and there's other UK nations. And why it was a building material is because it was what was most locally available and what was abundant, and it was the earth. So Cobb actually means lump of earth, and in Old English. And what they did was they built with freeform with mud that was reinforced with straw fibers, which are the fibers from which are the stalks of different grains that we're familiar with, such as wheat or oats or barley or whatever it may be. So what we're going to do today is just go through a little demonstration of the different constituents of Cobb. You guys have been working for a while to screen this clay, which you see here. This is the screen material which I pulled out from underneath your screens. And we did this to make it easier to work with and to make it easier to mix with the other materials. We have here the three materials that, well, I guess there's four materials that go into Cobb. First there's the clay, and we're going to do this, we're going to measure it out. But first there's clay, and there's sand, and then there's straw. And the fourth is water. So very simple, all things that we've probably all come across in our lives in some form. We're gonna all do our own mixes after I demonstrate, but essentially what we're looking for is a good sticky mixture that is also going to become very hard when it dries. So the clay is the sticky part, and the sand is the hard part, and the straw is the part that helps it from pulling apart. So we're going to do 1 part clay. We're going to do 3 parts sand. And we're going to start with that, and we'll add the straw in just a minute. We're going to mix that up nice and thoroughly. And yeah, it's like we're making a dough or a batter. You know,
Why do we need 3 cups of sand while we only need 1 cup?
So that's a very good question. This is kind of an artificial way of making it. Oftentimes what would happen in the olden days is that they would just dig a pit in their yard, and if there was a good enough clay content in the dirt, they would just use the dirt that they dug right out of the yard. If it already had a good sand content and a good clay content and it was mixed in the right proportions, they would use it directly as it was. And almost always that was the case. They would add a little bit of sand or a little bit of clay. But because what we did was we were digging a garden at Davy's house, and we came across a lot of really nice clay. We just harvested all that clay and brought it out here. And you see in this form, it's very hard to mix these little grains of sand with a big clump of clay, which is why we screened it down to 1/4 of an inch. And this, how we know this is clay is we did what's known as a jar test, and we shook it up. We shook the soil up with water, and we see that what settled out at the bottom, you can see there's very little of it, but there's a little bit of sand that settled out at the bottom. And it's almost entirely, there's so little sand that you can almost not see it. It's almost entirely clay, which is you know, a pretty common happening, but oftentimes you have a mix of sand and clay and silt, which are the 3 types of soil classifications. But the sand is the structure. The sand will not compress. Sand are small rocks, essentially. Sand has eroded down from rock over time to become these small little particles. And because it's rock, they won't compress it, they won't crush, and they provide strength. So if you were to stand on a grain of sand, if you were a really little person or whatever, and you could stand on a grain of sand, you wouldn't be able to crush it. With an extreme amount of force, you could. And so that's really the strength of our bench. If this could stay together on its own, if the sand could stay together on its own, we wouldn't need to use the clay. But what the clay has is the ability to hold water and bind it to itself and to other particles. So it binds the sand. In a sense, it's what's called a binder, and this is what's known as an aggregate in construction terms. And there are a lot of different parallels that we could draw, but essentially what you need to know is that you really only want to fill the voids in the sand with the clay. On a microscopic level, the clay is a much smaller particle, and it'll fill in between all of the little voids in between all the sand. Like, that may look like it's uniform, but there's a lot of air in between the particles of sand. And what the clay does is it comes in between all those gaps, and it binds all of the sand particles together so that instead of falling apart, they hold together. So if you look at the sand now and I drop it, it all just crumbles. But when I add the clay, you'll see what happens. And the proportion is something that has just been discovered over time is to be the right proportion. We're going to do 2 mixes actually. This one we're doing at a ratio of 3 parts sand to 1 part clay, which is 25% clay. And we're going to do another one on the other tarp, which is 4 parts sand to 1 part clay, which is 20% clay. And those have just been determined to be the most ideal content for making the strongest mortar, essentially. It's an earthen mortar, and we're going to form it into bricks. So this what I have right here is going to become a brick, and we're all going to get a chance to make our own bricks. So I've mixed it, and I want to mix it thoroughly so I don't have pockets that are just clay and pockets that are just sand. And so I'm just making a little indent in the middle here. This is kind of going to be a little volcano experiment here. And this is a way that, in modern times, that we've decided to mix these. I mean, in traditional times, there were a lot of different ways, and they often involve getting very muddy. So today, we're just going to do a little demonstration. And so, I'm just going to thoroughly wet the mix here. Now, and we want it to be homogeneous. Does anybody know what the word homogeneous means? Anybody? Come on, some of you guys have taken 6th or 7th grade science. Homogeneous. Anybody? Well, homogeneous means uniform in character. So we want it everywhere throughout this mix to be uniform. So we don't want to be like feeling over here and it feels like really sticky, and then feeling over here and it feels really sandy. We want it to be homogeneous. And I add a little bit too much water, but it's all right because we're just testing here. So that's a little bit more. This is wetter than we want it to be. And I'm also feeling it. It feels sandy. So we're going to see how this comes out. But part of the reason that it feels sandy is probably because I put too much water. The next step is that we're going to. I'm going to use this straw bale here. Is that we're going to add some straw to this. And this straw is what helps it from pulling apart. And it's a very small brick, so the straw is, it's outsized for the brick, but we're just going to mix it in there. And this is actually a very sandy mix, and I think we may increase the amount of clay that we put in it for the next brick that we make. But essentially, this is what Cobb is. And as it dries, it will harden. So right now, it's wet, and it doesn't really look like much, but when it dries it will become hard and it will kind of return to a state like this, which is similar to a rock. When you look at some of it, it's hard to distinguish the difference between a rock and the clay, and that's because when the clay dries out it hardens just like a rock. And so this is going to be our first test brick, and what we're going to do is we're all going to make test bricks, and I'm going to kind of direct us on what we want to do. And we're all going to get a chance to make a test brick, and we're going to write our name down, and we're going to come back next week and we're going to see how our brick does. We're going to test the strength of all the bricks that we do. So I'm going to get a piece of paper, or I'm going to have an assistant get me a piece of paper and a pen. So this right now is not something that I would use directly, because this is just by experience. This is the first time testing these materials, but it's too wet for one to really be able to tell the characteristics of it. So I've over-wet it, and when you've over-wet it, it's really hard to work, and it's erodible. So like it just kind of disappears on you. But the other thing that I feel like might be the case here is that there might be too much sand. So we might go down and do 2.5 cups of sand to 1, or 2 cups of sand to 1 cup of clay. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. We're going to do a second brick, which has just 2 cups of sand to 1 cup of clay. We'll do the same process. And just add a little bit of water, because I overwatered it last time. And we just add water little by little. Better to add less water and then more later than to add too much at the beginning.
they gonna paint them?
No, I don't think they're painting. These are just ones. They're going to make real ones that they're going to use.
But are they gonna paint the
What's
one
the finishing the nose?
Feeling a little better?
So what we have here is feeling a little better and still feeling a little bit sandy, which is all right. You know, different sands also have different qualities. I mean, when you're working with Cobb or with materials that you source locally or earthen materials in general, you want to experiment with them before you go to do your final product. And it's the same thing with all materials, but when you're discovering something for yourself, like pulling it out of your own backyard, like this clay and sand, which I'm not sure where it came from because Montgomery County Parks brought it to us, you just want to experiment, and that's the most important thing you can do. So it still feels a little bit sandy, but it's definitely feeling better. I didn't overwater it this time. One of the tests that you can do with Cobb before you add the straw in is you can form it into a ball that's about the size of your palm, whatever size your palm is, and you can drop it and see how it reacts, and you can tell that if it stays together, that's a good thing. You don't want it to deform too much when it hits the tarp, but it will deform some. As you can see, it flattens out a little bit, and it can be a sign that it's a little sandy is that it cracks some. And that's just showing that the binding between grains of sand isn't complete, which is all right because an overly sandy mix is better than an overly clayey mix, as long as there's enough to hold it together. But I'm going to add a little bit of straw to this mix as well, and we'll call this test brick number 2. And we'll figure out. I think we're going to need to develop a little system to keep track of which brick is which, and who made their brick, so we can come back and look at them next week. And the shape of your brick is not super important. Brick-like is more what we're aiming for. And I'm going to do one more before we all start to experiment on our own. I'm going to go down to 1 part clay to 1 part sand, just to see how that acts. So it's kind of like a loaf more than it is like a brick. And that's all right. So one of the issues you can sometimes get with sand is that if you have silt mixed in with your sand, which is silt essentially, soil is classified into 3 different classifications, and it's based on the particle size. Clay is the finest, sand is the largest particle size. What's in between is silt, and it doesn't serve any function in construction. It's good for other things, but it's not good for construction. And if you have a dirty, what's known as a dirty sand, it's a sand that has a lot of silt in it, that silt can take up some of the binding capabilities of the clay without providing any of the strength of the sand. So that's something to be very aware of if you're going to be doing any of this at home, is to know that you have a good clean sand and to know that your clay is actually clay and it's not silt. Those are very important distinctions. And the clay, and we can actually go through this. We can actually go through and have a look at the clay on its own in a moment. And you can see what a good clay, what qualities and characteristics that a good clay has. So this is feeling better. This is feeling nice. Feeling a little bit stiffer, but still has a good sand content. And this, I think, is what we're going to aim for.
1 to 1.
1 to 1. And we may do some experimentation around this. We might just do a ½ a cup sand to 1 cup of clay. And this is it. You really, there's a rule of thumb that what you want is between 20 and 25% clay in your mix, but it all depends on what materials you have. So that is just saying that, generally speaking, that when you have 1/4 of your mix is clay, you're going to have enough binding power to hold your mix together. But if that's not the case, this is why it's extremely important to do tests. So now I'm feeling this ball, and it's feeling a lot stronger. It's binding together a lot more. I like the feel. So a part of it is getting the feel together. You also have some simple field tests. You can see that when I drop that one, there's less cracking. You know, it's still flattened out on the bottom a little bit, but there's less cracking on the surface, which means that the binding is better between particles of sand. And I'm gonna go ahead and pass this one around so that you guys can feel. Don't be scared. You know, you guys all played with this when you were babies, and it's good stuff. And really, I actually think that I probably should not have added straw to these, because they're we're not really testing them for tensile strength, which is what the straw provides. We're really testing them for hardness, and we're really testing the combination of sand and clay, and trying to find the ideal sand and clay mix. So adding straw to those first bricks was a mistake. But anyhow, they'll be fine. We'll make some other test bricks, and we'll kind of scrap those. But that's what we have. I really like this mix. This is the best that we've come with so far. So I think I'm just going to get everybody, when we get started, to make 1-to-1 sand to clay bricks. And you can make them any size you want. You can make cute little bricks. You can make, you know, nice big bricks, the size of bricks that you see in houses. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to show you guys what the clay looks like when it gets wet on its own. And you can feel that alongside the clay and sand ball that I just passed around. So So this, you can feel, this is just clay. This is just clay that we had harvested out of Davey's backyard. And again, you know, we did a jar test, which is a pretty traditional field test, and we saw that it's, you know, normally what you'll see is distinct lines between what happens when you do a jar test is that the heaviest things settle out first. So the largest particles are going to settle out first. The sand settles to the bottom, the silt settles in between, and the clay settles out last. So what you'll normally see if you have a soil that has all three constituents is three distinct lines. Is the sand at the bottom, the silt in the middle, and the clay at the top. But what we have here is almost completely clay. So you can't really see that differentiation. But what you see here, when you drop that, it's a little bit different. But you can, I mean, where you feel it, another field test is a roll test, like what's called the snake test informally. But it's a plasticity test, and it's how long can you roll out a snake before it breaks apart, and it's the clay that allows it to roll out very thin. And you normally do it on a table, or you can do a hanging test. So something about this clay is it's not extremely sticky. Different clays also have very different qualities. Some clays are extremely sticky and absorb a lot of water. Some clays are less sticky. They can all be used, but again, your mix needs to be adjusted based on the type of clay that you have. So that's something to be aware of when you're doing your own building as well. But I'm going to pass this around so you can feel just what the clay feels like. And the issue with using just this is that like when it dries, it will start to crack, because as the water leaves it, each clay particle holds multiple times its own weight in water. And so as it leaves, it splits apart. And another issue is that its compressive strength is much less than that of sand. So that's why we mix the sand in, so that it's stronger in compression when it's being loaded on from above, like when we're sitting on a bench. So if everybody wants to clear off of our mats, off of our tarps, we can begin to do our own experimentation.
No problem.
Jane, could you get me a couple more of these?